To end the unit on World War II, we're going to be looking at the causes of the war, both in Europe and in Asia, to get an overall view of how this war impacted not only the individuals involved and their families, but also the economic, political, and social changes that took place after World War II. If you look at the top of your screen, you can see some possible essay questions that you might be presented with on paper 2 in regards to the results of World War II. So we're going to start the recording today by looking at how this war affected Europe. So this will be part 1 of a recording about the impact of World War II on Europe as a whole, and then we'll do another recording about its impact in the Pacific, which is a totally different story. You can see here just in human cost, with death tolls and dislocations and people suffering from the effects of the war, of some of the statistics that you see here. Like we said with the last chapter at the end about total war, that as many as 50 million people were killed in World War II, and some people put that estimate much higher than 50 million, even up to 75 million. We also saw in the section about total war at the end of chapter 8 that as many as 2/3 of the deaths in World War II were civilian deaths. So this war definitely exemplified the total war feature of targeting of civilians and impact on civilians. Just in Europe alone, there were nearly 40 million people dead. So that's a big portion of the death toll in World War II because of the fighting that took place across Europe with Hitler and Stalin, and even down into northern Africa. Not only were many people killed directly during the war, but because of the fighting and the bombing, there were many places that were in ruin, and therefore many people were displaced from their homes and had to relocate after the war. Many people from Europe that were in this situation fled to different countries, the United States being a big one. But just the fact of having to pick up and move and start their life over shows a definite human cost of this war. Not only that, but in certain situations there were forced removals, not necessarily because people had to move because of ruins, but they were expelled from their country for whatever reason. If you look right here, that during the end of the war and then directly after, there were as many as 30 million people that were forced to be removed from their homes from people like Hitler and Stalin. So quite a bit of movement and dealing with the loss and the ruins of the fighting, and in some cases that's worse than the actual combat itself. In Germany, the entire country almost was completely in ruins from all of the area bombing that had been committed by the Allies. Many people that were in German-speaking areas were forced to move to Germany itself after World War II, and they were moving into a country that was already in ruins. So for many of these people, they suffered along the way, many died, and so the conditions in Europe after World War II were absolutely horrific. Not only were they dealing with loss of life of family members, but physical destruction of their towns, which had to all be rebuilt, which cost money, was definitely difficult for these people to overcome. I would encourage you to look at the chart on page 175, which gives you a breakdown of the different countries involved in World War II, the major countries anyways, and looking at how many people were mobilized for the war effort and saw combat, and then how many of those were killed, both military and civilians. And you can see that definitely there were dramatic statistics here. It talks about above that chart on page 175 that Poland lost 1/5 of its population, and most of those were civilians. A lot of this had to do with the Holocaust and the concentration camps. But that just shows you how dramatic World War II was. It was definitely the most deadly war that the world has ever seen. It has not been surpassed, thank goodness. But it's the best example of a total war that we have. In addition to the human cost of World War II, there was definitely a tremendous loss in economy. As opposed to World War I, where the fighting was confined along the fronts, the fighting in World War II took place over most of Europe, and so therefore many cities were in ruins, which directly ties in with the human cost. The cost to rebuild these cities was astronomical. These countries could not afford that type of reconstruction, which is why later on, in the years directly after World War II, countries like the United States had to step up their efforts to assist these countries in the rebuilding process. Another feature of World War II was the fact that in Europe, many of the allies, such as Great Britain and France, were just as much as ruined as the losing countries of the Axis powers. So they also had to be assisted in getting back on their feet, even though they had technically won the war. Along with all of this devastation, infrastructure of countries was severely wiped out and had to be brought back up on its feet. Things like roads and bridges and communication systems, industry and farmland was all in ruins. So to get a country back on its feet economically to where they can be viable in the world economy again would take a great deal of time and assistance from other countries. This could also spell conditions for future problems between countries as they struggled to get back on their feet. And one thing that we were concerned about here in the U.S. is avoiding a repeat of what happened in the years after World War I, where there was power vacuums left by some of the devastation, and that allowed individuals like Hitler to take advantage. We wanted to make sure that didn't happen, which influenced the United States' decisions to create certain policies like containment and the Marshall Plan. In addition to this, the economic cost of food production fell because of all of the devastation of farmland and industries where food is processed was devastated, so therefore the people could not be fed adequately, which again ties into the human cost. And so therefore many people were now dependent on their governments for food relief, living assistance, places to live in that were at least somewhat habitable. Countries were bankrupted, even like you can see here, Great Britain, who was a winning country of the war. The Soviet Union as well were part of the Allies, and their economy from all the fighting with Operation Barbarossa was definitely down the tubes. Many people were left homeless in the Soviet Union because of that intense fighting. So here again, you can see that the winning countries were in just as much of a desperate state as the losing countries. So all these economic conditions would have to be corrected, and so that problems like what happened after World War I could be avoided in the future. Unfortunately for the world, the way that these issues were addressed by countries like the United States, a lot of that set up the conditions of the Cold War, which would last until the end of the 1980s. Let's look now at the political consequences of World War II. First of all, involving boundary changes. Unlike World War I, where there were significant boundary changes, such as with the Treaty of Versailles, there were relatively few boundary changes after World War II. If you look on page 176 at the quote by Tony Judt underneath the heading that says political consequences, you can see this, and that instead in World War II there were people that were moved as opposed to country borders. Yet there were still some countries that did see border changes, and most of these were with Germany and with Poland. And this is because obviously with Germany, they were seen as the main instigator of the war in Europe, and so what was going to be the future of that country was of a huge concern. And also Poland, since that was the country where the war in Europe started officially, because it was secretly divided up between the Germans and the Soviets, that country had to be dealt with as well. So those were where most of the boundary changes in Europe took place. This decision-making process actually occurred before the war was technically over at the Yalta Conference, which took place in February of 1945. There was another conference later on at Potsdam, which was in July of 1945, where they made further decisions. These conferences were attended by what was known as the Big Three, and these were the leaders from the Soviet Union, which was Joseph Stalin, Great Britain, which was Winston Churchill, and then from the United States at Yalta, it was Franklin Roosevelt, but then at Potsdam, it was Harry Truman, since Roosevelt died in April of 1945. So I can show you here for the Yalta Conference, which was the first of the two, some of the decisions that were made between the Big Three. The significance of this Yalta Conference was that it definitely set up many of the political conditions which began the Cold War because of the disagreements between the Big Three. It was pretty much between Roosevelt and Churchill versus Stalin. We were all allies working together to bring down Hitler, which we knew was going to be happening in the very near future by February of 1945, yet we were divided over what should be the future of Europe. In the Yalta Conference, they decided that Germany should be divided up into 4 occupation zones, and a zone would be given to each of the major Allied powers, which would be the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and then a 4th one was later assigned to France. Even though they were defeated by Hitler early on in the war, once they were liberated, they did contribute to the Allies' success to an extent, and because they were joined up with Britain at the beginning of the war, before they were taken over. So that was a decision that was made. Another issue was the boundaries of Poland, which was hotly disputed between Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt. Not only were the borders of Poland discussed, but also the future of elections in that country and whether or not these would be free elections that were unfettered by suspicion and persuasion by the Soviets to become communist. So this is what you can see was discussed at some of these conferences. Unfortunately, after the conferences and the war was over, mostly the countries in Eastern Europe that had been liberated from the Nazis by the Soviet Union became what was called satellite nations of the Soviet Union. In other words, the Soviets directly influenced what type of a government these countries were going to have, which obviously would be communist. The Soviets sent agents and other types of personnel into these countries to make sure they followed Soviet procedures and protocol. Therefore, Eastern European countries were not completely independent, even though they weren't directly annexed by the Soviet Union. They were within the Soviet sphere of influence for sure. And you can also see that these decisions that were made by the Soviets, even though they promised to give these places, especially Poland, free elections, that did not happen for sure, even though on the surface it might have appeared to be that way. Definitely the Soviets influenced the outcome of these votes in these countries getting on their feet again to become communist at the end of World War II. If you look at the map on page 177, you can see the map of Europe and the areas that became under Soviet control indirectly, which would be these satellite countries, places like Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and then the areas that were outright annexed by the Soviet Union, which are in the orangish color. And these were areas that the Soviets had taken over during the war itself. So definitely Stalin got his way with expanding his communist influence throughout Eastern Europe. This was going to be a major point of contention in the Cold War. The fact that we didn't want him to extend his quote-unquote Iron Curtain across Europe and make other countries become communist as well. That's basically the essence of the Cold War, was preventing the spread of communism. Germany became the symbol of the Cold War in Europe for 40 years almost, because this temporary division that was supposed to end with the unification of the country shortly after World War II never came. Instead, the country was permanently divided into East and West Germany up until the end of the 1980s because of these disagreements between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union going back to the Yalta Conference. So pretty much the end of World War II spelled the beginning of the Cold War. Finally, to go along with the beginning of the Cold War, we'll end this recording with the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the new superpowers of the world, and the fact that World War II is what caused that to happen. If you look at this quote by Dean Acheson, who was a very influential politician in the early years of the Cold War in creating the American containment policy of communism, you can see that his analysis of the conditions in Europe after World War II meant a complete change in how the world was going to be governed and structured in the years to come. And he says that the whole world structure and order that we had inherited from the 19th century was gone. So instead of old-style European diplomacy and countries like Britain and France dominating world politics and economy, it was now the United States and the Soviet Union that were going to be the new superpowers of the world. There are different reasons why this happened, and you can see these listed at the bottom of 177 and then ending up through the middle of page 178. There are military reasons, economic reasons, and political reasons. So I would encourage you to pause the recording, look at these different bullet points to show why the USA and the USSR emerged as these superpowers, and why countries that had once experienced world domination and significance were no longer in that position anymore. To me, probably the biggest reason for the emergence of the United States anyways is that unlike after World War I, where we retreated into isolationism, we now were willing to play an active role in the world's economy and the world's political scene. We were committed to the ideals of free trade and collaboration in economic matters. So you can see on page 178 that we were basically taking the lead in creating organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, so that there could be more free trade and less tariffs and trade blocks like there had been before World War II. And then with political reasons, we were committed to expanding democracy throughout the world and making sure that countries that were getting back on their feet did not fall into authoritarian rules again, whether that be communist or single-party right-wing states, like what Germany and Japan had had. The Soviet Union, even though they were heavily devastated by World War II, unlike the United States, they still were able to have a key role in this scene after World War II because of the fact that they were able to defeat the Nazis on the Eastern Front, and they were involved in some of the decision-making after World War II. So these conditions after World War II, and again, make sure that you look at these different bullet points on 177 and 178 to get an understanding of why the U.S. and the Soviet Union were in the positions that they were following World War II. The Soviets basically saw the opportunity to use communism as a way to fill the power vacuum left by the collapse of these colonial empires. So that kind of showed their desires. We'll pick up again in the next recording.